introduce Dr. Kenneth Robinson, who's currently serving as a special visiting scholar at the Northeast Asian History Foundation. His research focuses on Korean-Japanese relations in the 15th and 16th century, and also on Korean maps of Choson Korea and Japan from the same centuries. Originally from California, Dr. Robinson studied at Stanford University and completed his PhD at University of Hawaii. He also studied and taught at University of Tokyo and taught at Nagoya University, as well as at the International Christian University in Tokyo. He published many books and journals, and also translated many Korean literature into English. Today, he's going to speak on a very interesting topic on Korean-Japanese relations. Korea-Japan relation has not been always cordial, but he's going to bring us back to 5th-6th century and how Korea and Japan work together. So, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Robinson with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'd also like to thank the RASKB for this kind invitation to bore you for the next hour of 15th and 16th century history. Those of us who study the pre-modern period are always encouraged to see an audience in front of us. The modern historians, the political scientists, have somehow far more fans than we do. Excuse me. As advertised, tonight's presentation is Pirates and Traders and Fake Japanese, too. Korean-Japanese relations from 1392 to 1592. And you may be wondering what fake Japanese refers to, and I think that will become clear very soon. So, without further ado, obviously we'll cover about 200 years of Korean-Japanese relations in about 40-45 minutes. So there should be lots of room for questions of issues not covered or issues not explained well enough. We'll focus on piracy, trade, and these fake Japanese, that is, imposter identities. And I'll return to that soon enough. These three themes intersect throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries of relations between the Korean government and a wide variety of Japanese living in the western provinces and in central Japan, or perhaps not living at all. The first two things, piracy and trade, are linked through the success of the Choson government's policies toward the Japanese pirates in the late 14th century, early 15th century, and toward traders, in other words, encouraging trade in the early 15th century. The second and third themes, again, trade and fake Japanese, are closely related with trade and with the Choson government's policies, making trade through fake Japanese or imposter identities possible. We see imposter trade by Japanese from the mid-15th century up to the eve of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea in 1592. In short, first, the Choson government's encouragement of trade in the early 15th century ended the activities of the pirates. These, of course, are the Wegu, as some of you know them in Korean, or the Wako, as some of you know them in Japanese. Second, The possibilities that peaceful trade offered Japanese in Western provinces and the trade regulations that the Choson government introduces in the 15th century contributed to the creation of these imposter identities and the imposter trade that they conducted. And third, the Choson government's lack of information about elite families in Western and Central Japan in the 15th and 16th centuries contributed greatly to the proliferation and use of these imposter identities. So we begin with piracy. In the late 14th century, we see the appearance of new governments in both Korea and in Japan. From Korea to Choson in 1392 in Korea, of course, but the situation in Japan was much more complicated. After the collapse of the Kamakura Bakufu, the first military government in Japan, in eastern Japan, in the first half of the 14th century, two claimants to the next government emerged in Kyoto soon thereafter. These were the Southern Court and the Northern Court, or the Nambokucho, for those of you familiar with the Japanese vocabulary. And a civil war fought by these two groups forced samurai families to choose a side, and then sometimes to choose the other side when things weren't going well. One result was that governance in the provinces deteriorated, especially in the western provinces of the island of Honshu, throughout Kyushu, and the offshore islands of Tsushima and of Iki. Tsushima, or Temado, as it's read in the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese characters, is, as you know, between Busan and Kyushu. The small island of Iki is off the west coast of northern Kyushu, and is very difficult to get to. In the late 14th century, Japanese began sailing from Tsushima, Iki, and the Matsuura area, north of today's Nagasaki, to the Korean peninsula and raided coastal areas for food. And this is still during the civil war between the southern and northern courts. They also carried back Koreans, and they also took items from Buddhist temples. Hundreds of such raids occurred into the first 2 decades of the 15th century. Now, more specifically, in the late 14th century, Japanese had great success along the southern coast of the peninsula, particularly Gyeongsang and Cholla. One of the reasons for this was a lingering shadow from the period of the Yuan government, the Mongol rule of Korea, or Korea. The Mongols forbid the Koreans from building large ships for obvious reasons. Large ships were already being used for carrying grain from the southern provinces up to the island of Kanghwa-do, where the Korean king was living. But the Mongols obviously didn't want military ships, naval ships, to be built. So when the Japanese started attacking the southern coast, there were no large navy ships capable of firing upon or attacking the Japanese pirates. Soon enough, however, these types of ships appeared, and soon enough, the Korea government, the early Choson government, very quickly achieved success. The Japanese responded, and they began sailing in larger groups of ships to the peninsula. And instead of focusing on the area where they had been recently successful, they started sailing up the eastern coast, sailing up the western coast, and arriving at a destination. They would get off the ships, run inland, and pillage, plunder, reach a city, take what they could from the city, go back to their ships, and sail back to Japan. It's this type of these types of activities in the early 15th century that the Choson government successfully brings to an end through the offer of trade, of peaceful trade. Successfully converting these raiders to traders, the Choson government now had to design regulations and rules for managing this new peaceful interaction with the Japanese. Government officials realized that they could not limit interaction with Japan to the retired shogun. That is, to step into Japanese history for a moment, there is a shogun, as all of you know, of course, but in the late 14th century, until his death in 1407, the real power in Japan was held by the shogun's father, the retired shogun, whose name was Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. To limit trade between the Korean king and the ruler of Japan was not going to solve completely the piracy problem. So the Korean government quickly decided to encourage local elites in Tsushima, in Iki Island, in Kyushu, in western Honshu to begin trading in Choson. A central feature of the Choson government's trade regulations was the hierarchy that they designed for managing trade by Japanese. Our clearest understanding of this hierarchy is from a Choson government report published several decades later, and we'll use that to understand this hierarchy. The Choson government divided the Japanese into 4 grades, 4 levels. Within some of these grades, the Japanese were divided into further distinctions of rank, so to speak. So in the first grade, the highest grade, were the king of Japan, who of course again is the shogun, not the emperor. The emperor of Japan was not involved in any way that's visible from Korean sources or from Japanese sources in this interaction. So we have the king of Japan and also the king of Ryukyu, today's Okinawa. In the second grade were families serving in the central government, the Muromachi Bakufu in Kyoto, and the Ouchi family, which lived in western Honshu and was extremely powerful at that time, and a good friend of the Choson government for various reasons. In the third grade were the provincial governor, right, to use the Japanese phrase for a moment, the shugo. The provincial governor of Tsushima, when he sent what the Korean government called a special envoy to Korea. Now, we don't need to talk about this special envoy in our context tonight. But a second Japanese elite in this third grade was the Kyushu deputy. Now, in the late 14th century, the Kyushu deputy was extremely powerful in northern Kyushu and contributed to suppressing the sailing of pirate groups to Korea. But by the 1420s, the Kyushu deputy has almost no power whatsoever in Kyushu. So we won't worry much about the Kyushu deputy. And in the fourth grade were all other Japanese. And all other Japanese becomes a very important category when we talk in a few minutes about the imposter identities. Now, these contacts included the provincial governor of Tsushima when he sent trade ships to Korea. And the Korean government permitted him to send 50 trade ships to Korea each year. This is far, far more than any other Japanese was permitted. Also in the fourth grade were other Tsushima islanders who sent trade ships, and just about everyone else from Japan who sent trade ships, particularly the Kyushu area. There was one other group, which I have to mention so that I don't need to mention them again, and that is this particular type of Japanese person to whom the Choson government gave a nominal military position, right? They received the post but they didn't have to serve in the military. They could stay in Japan and send one trade ship every year. But unlike the other Japanese who sailed to Japan, these men who received the nominal military posts also received Korean military clothing, so that when they went to Korea and traveled up to Seoul, they had to wear the military clothing when they met the king of Choson. Again, they're the only people who had to do this. And they are not models for the imposter trade. Okay. The Japanese who conduct the trade, however, don't go to Korea. They send a representative. Right? The governor of Tsushima is very busy being the governor of Tsushima, so he sends representatives, as do other people in Kyushu and in Honshu. Now, from the 1420s, the Choson government begins to impose a broad variety of these regulations that I mentioned a moment ago. The regulations grow in number and in complexity over time. Again, we'll use this report that I mentioned earlier from later decades to see some of these regulations. But it's very important to keep in mind that the quality and the quantity of the trade that you could conduct in Choson, right, fell at each of the 4 grades. Right? So the shogun, the king of Japan, he could trade much more richly, so to speak, than could his contacts at the 4th reception grade. If any of you have seen The History of the World Part 1 with Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. I guess no one else has seen that. That's probably my only attempt at a joke. Laugh now. Okay. Let's focus on the 4th grade, because as I mentioned, that's where the largest number of these contacts are placed by the Choson government. The Choson court, the king, issued to these contacts at the 4th grade a personal seal, right? Just think of a tojang, right? And that seal was made of copper, and into the face of the seal was carved the contact's given name, right? Not the family name. The family name was too common. The given name was unique. So it was much easier to identify the trader through the given name. So when I want to send my trade ship to Korea, I had to write a letter of introduction, or perhaps a Buddhist monk would write the letter of introduction for me. And on that letter, I would stamp the personal seal. And so that seal, right, would guarantee that the letter has come from me and not from someone else. En route to Choson, my representative had to stop in Tsushima. Not because the Japanese government forced him to, but because the Korean government forced him to. In Tsushima, he received, my representative received, what I translated into English as a travel permit. And this was actually a Korean government document that Koreans needed, if you were of a certain social status, for traveling from one county to another, right, from Momo-Momo-Sian to Momo-Momo-Mo. You had to have this type of document from a local Korean official. So here the king of Korea is imposing this rule onto the Japanese traders. And the governor of Tsushima, appointed by the shogun of Japan, issues to my representative the Korean government document, the travel permit. So when my ship arrives at a specific port in Gyeongsang province, right, he presents the letter of introduction with seal, impression, and the travel permit. The Korean officials at the port in Gyeongsang province confirm all of this, and from there, my representative can begin the process of trading in Korea. There were 3 ports that were open in Gyeongsang province for most of the 15th century. For most of the 16th century, the port of Busan was open. So the ships typically in the 16th century entered through Busan. Now, where did the first Japanese army to invade Chosun in 1592 attack? Busan. Now, according to one count by someone, a Japanese scholar, from 1392 through 1504, which are the years for which we have the best data about Japanese trade, 4,632 embassies from the shoguns and trade missions reached Chosun. One more time. 4,632 trade missions. That is a lot of trade. It's from this point now that we can begin to discuss fake Japanese. These fake Japanese were designed in Japan for trading in Chosun with the real Chosun government. Each of these fake identities was designed to fit into one of those 4 grades that I mentioned earlier, and they were designed to be recognizable to Korean officials. And they had to have a family name that the Korean government could confirm by asking another Japanese. Do you know the family name Tanaka? Oh, yeah. This is one way that the Korean government could check on these contacts. Now, we see several patterns of usage of these imposter identities from the mid-15th century until 1590. In other words, the Japanese involved in this trade were extremely inventive to be able to carry this out for 150 years. And they knew that the Chosun government did not have detailed information about people and events in Western and Central Japan. We'll return to this point about the lack of knowledge later. Here are a few examples, just a few, of these imposter identities. In 1459, Chiba Mototane, who was based in central Kyushu, received permission from the Korean government to send 1 trade ship each year. He died in 1464, after the court had received 2 of his trade ships. Despite his death, Mototane trade missions continued to arrive in Korea until at least 1504. It would seem that the governor of Tsushima held the Mototane personal seal that the Korean government had issued, right? Probably, maybe, we don't know, from 1459 or so. In other words, maybe it was the governor of Tsushima who has used the Chiba Mototane identity, right, the real person's name, to request trade in Korea. Chiba Mototane lived in the central Kyushu. Whether he even knew about trading with the real Chiba, we don't know if he even knew about trade in Korea. So, did the real Chiba Mototane receive permission to trade in Korea, or did someone else? Another example is the personal seal for someone named Ouchi Noriyuki. The Noriyuki that traded in Choson wrote his, quote-unquote his, given name with different Chinese characters than the real Noriyuki who lived in Western Honshu. From 1466, Japanese, somewhere, began a concerted effort to utilize the Korean king, King Sejo's, interest in Buddhism. Sejo, who reigned, as you know, from 1455 to 1468, displayed great support for Buddhism during his time as king. One example not too far from here, of course, is the pagoda at Pagoda Park, Maitapakula Park. As many of you know, that park originally was Wangaksa, at a temple that Sejo founded during his reign. The Japanese who visited Seoul learned of Sejo's support of Buddhism and soon began to use Buddhism as a means of requesting personal seals for new imposter identities. From 1466 to 1468, Japanese sent at least 33 trade missions under new identities. However, for whatever reason, the Choson government gave none of these first-time contacts a personal seal for annual trade. In other words, these contacts could not send a second trade mission. If you didn't receive the personal seal at that fourth reception grade, then you could not continue to trade. Now, the Japanese planners of these imposter trade missions sent them from, quote-unquote, from actual ports, harbors, towns, and toll stations around the Inland Sea, the Seto Naikai, and along the western coast of Honshu. The composers of these identities may have selected these scattered places so to cultivate the impression that word of these various miracles or the sightings of Buddha's relics, for example, in Choson. Right? The news of this had spread rapidly in Japan, and the Japanese throughout the western half of the country had learned of these wondrous events. I recall, of course, that Japan was then and remains very much a Buddhist society. Now, the contacts that are denied, they represented various professions, including local official and pirate. Literally, the texts tell us that they were heijo, kaizoku. No Buddhist monks appear, however. Interesting. And even an imposter contact affiliated with a Shinto shrine sent a trade mission. Now, the person under whose name that mission sailed in the 1460s had died in 1446. So the variety of occupations, too, may have been meant to impress Sejo with the breadth of interest. However, Sejo's death in 1468 ends these particular efforts. Meanwhile, in 1466, King Sejo had returned from a visit to the Kumgang Mountains, which all of you know far better than I do, continue to be important in Korean Buddhism. Here we see a different type of inventiveness in designing imposter identities. Back in Seoul, then, Sejo greets a Japanese Buddhist monk called Jurin. Sejo gave Jurin a letter to present to the Japanese shogun. Jurin sailed back to Japan, but instead of sailing through the Inland Sea to Kyoto, which was the common route, instead he sailed up the western coast of Honshu, stopped at the port of Obama, yes, Obama, and followed the road from Obama to Kyoto. In 1470, Jurin departs from Kyoto for Choson, this time sailing through the Inland Sea. Now, in 1467, when he returns to Japan, And in 1470, when the sails back to Choson, representatives of local Japanese elites along these two routes, right, through the inland sea, right, towards Korea, and northward along the western coast of Honshu. The representatives of local Japanese elites, one more time, representatives of local Japanese elites who claimed that they had escorted Julian along the coast and through the sea, requested personal seals. However, as earlier with the requests based upon Seijo's Buddhism, the Choson government does not give them personal seals. That is, the Choson court refused to recognize these escorts of Julian, right, in the future as Japanese contacts, as traders with the government. We turn now to the third of these grades, the second highest of these grades, the Muromachi Bakufu officials. Now these, the first imposter Bakufu official greeted the king of Choson in 1455. In this instance, the sponsors deployed the Hatakeyama family and assigned their Hatakeyama Yoshitada to the post of deputy shogun. The real Hatakeyama family lived in Kyoto and was one of the three families that were eligible to serve as deputy shogun, which was the highest post below the shogun. And there were three families from which the deputy shogun was selected. The Hatakeyama were one of these families. And not surprisingly, Japanese who are designing these imposter identities begin to use the two other shogun deputy families, as well as other Bakufu families in Kyoto. In short, all of the more than 12 Bakufu officials, under whose names and government positions more than 30 trade missions sailed to Choson between 1455 and 1474, were fake Japanese. Well, the real shogun in the real Kyoto informed the real king of Choson in the real year 1474, the two Bakufu officials who had sent trade missions in 1470 were imposters. The shogun had not known of these missions at the time and had not approved of them, as he informed the Choson government. The shogun then suggested that a new system of identification be introduced in order to prevent future imposter Bakufu officials. The Choson government agreed and introduced what I call an ivory tally system in 1474. The king of Choson required that the envoys of the king of Japan, the shogun, right, and the envoys of Bakufu officials present one ivory tally, in addition to the letter of introduction that they carried and the travel permit that they obtained in Tsushima. Now, the tallies were divided in half, okay? And on one face of the tallies were inscribed a particular phrase, and on the other face were inscribed a particular phrase. To match the two tallies, it was to match, let's say we're going to use tally number 1, right? Part of the character, the Chinese character for 1, is on this half of the tally, and the other half, right, the other character for number 1 is on this half, and you match them, and voila, you have tally number 1. So okay. So that's how the ivory tally works. The left halves remained in Choson, and the right halves were left with the shogun, who then gave them to the legitimate Bakufu officials. Undaunted by this new system that would require them to become Bakufu officials and receive a tally from the shogun, Japanese devised various other schemes over the next century. Yes, there's more. And over the next century and more for achieving imposter trade without an ivory tally and with an ivory tally. In the late 15th century, thus, they begin seeking to circumvent or find a loophole in this new ivory tally system. Because remember, as I said earlier, the higher your grade in that hierarchy, right, the better the trade, right, and the more trade you can conduct. So conducting trade at the second grade is much better than conducting trade at the fourth grade. So the first test of the Choson government's willingness to enforce the ivory tally comes in 1479, 5 years later. This mission, whose representative must not have carried an ivory tally, failed to sidestep this ivory tally requirement. In other words, the Korean government said, no, go home. In 1482, the real shogun's real envoy presents a real ivory tally, and the Korean government is happy, and the real shogun, through his representative, is able to trade in Choson. 2 years earlier, however, in 1480, another representative of another fake Bakufu official arrives, this time with a long explanation of why he arrived without an ivory tally. The Japanese involved in this mission are seeking their own set of ivory tallies. So in his letter, we learn that in 1474, the embassy carrying the real ivory tallies from Seoul to Kyoto had not been able to sail through the inland sea because of the war, the Onin War, that was then engulfing central Japan. Now remember, the ivory tallies have indeed reached the shogun. There's no doubt there. So instead of sailing through the inland sea, the embassy proceeds northward along the western coast of Honshu. Bad weather then forced the ship off course and up the coast to the, quote, the country of the northern barbarians. Only, quote, last year had the shogun, that is their imposter shogun, and this Bakufu official learned of the 1474 envoy's whereabouts. The ship was immediately dispatched to bring that envoy and the king of Choson's state letter and gifts and ivory tallies to Kyoto, but the deputy shogun in Kyoto had yet to be updated on this rescue effort. Concerned that the shogun might be behaving rudely toward the king of Choson because of the missing state letter and the royal gifts, this imposter Bakufu official asked the king of Choson to tell him the contents of the letter that had been sent to the real shogun in 1474 so that he could relay that information to the shogun. Now, you can clearly see, I hope, that this is a ruse. Right? They're trying to find out what was in the letter so they can respond more effectively and somehow achieve their own ivory tally. If they had been successful, this new ivory tally system would have replaced the shogun's ivory tally system, would it not have? Second, the new ivory tallies would not have removed participation or oversight from the king of Japan. Rather, the imposter king of Japan would now oversee the use of the ivory tallies, not the real shogun in Kyoto. Third, the possession of these new tallies would revive trade through imposter Bakufu officials, which the real 1474 ivory tallies had been intended to stop. Right? The shogun has complained that two fake shogun officials, bakufu officials, right, had gone to Choson in 1470. If skillfully executed, this ruse would have left the Choson court without knowing that new ivory tallies had been entrusted to an imposter king of Japan. In the end, the Choson government did not issue a new set of ivory tallies. But we get a sense of the lengths to which Japanese involved in this imposter trade would go in order to enhance their trade in Choson. Now here, I would pause and introduce two cases of Japanese inventing foreign countries and attempting to initiate foreign relations in the first reception grade. That, of course, for foreign rulers. However, our time is short. Several decades later, as political disputes and battles continued in central Japan, the shogun was forced to leave Kyoto. Now we're in the 1510s at this point. He settled in western Honshu, living with the Ouchi family that we've met already. This shogun in exile rewarded the Ouchi by giving them some of the real ivory tallies that had been issued in 1474. Back in Kyoto, the new shogun asks the Choson government for new ivory tallies, right? In other words, to prevent those tallies that have been taken to the Ouchi family from being used. And he received a new set in 1504. He entrusted these ivory tallies, these new ivory tallies, to the Otomo family, which was a very powerful family in northern Kyushu, and which supported him, and which had also traded for many, many decades with the government. These new tallies invalidated, obviously, the tallies held by the shogun in exile and the Ouchi. However, the shogun in Kyoto also entrusts two of the new tallies to the Ouchi family. No one has figured out why. How these ivory tallies in Kyoto and western Japan were used is not yet clear. It appears, though, that all of the King of Japan embassies that are sent to Choson from this time on were imposter shogun embassies produced in western Japan, that they're not sailing from Kyoto. And these 1504 these 1504 ivory tallies are used not only for imposter shoguns, but also for imposter bakufu officials that will continue to be sent to Choson into the 1580s. These two patterns of interaction, right, through imposter shoguns and through imposter bakufu officials, will carry new significance and new importance after Toyotomi Hideyoshi begins to pressure the Choson government regarding his own interest in attacking China in the second half of the 1580s. We'll return to this theme in a few minutes. Let's jump back to 1510. Remember, there are three ports in Gyeongsang province that are open to Japanese trade. So the Choson government has begun to figure out by this time that these contacts at the fourth reception grade that had received personal seals in the 1460s and 1470s must be dying now. And they begin to more strictly enforce their oversight of trade that also was conducted at the open ports, but also of the documents that Japanese are carrying in. They're reading these letters of introduction much more carefully. They're checking their records, the soul, much more carefully now. Japanese in the three ports stage a riot in all of these ports in 1510. The violence continues on and off for several months. The Korean government is not happy, and eventually the Korean government closes all of these three ports, and it eliminates trade privileges as punishment. It eliminates trade privileges for all of the Tsushima Islanders except the provincial governor. For Tsushima, this reduced the number of trade ships that islanders could send from approximately 74 trade ships to the 25 trade ships that the Korean government now permitted the provincial governor to send. Remember, in the past, he could send 50 trade ships each year. Now, only 25. So this cut from approximately 74 trade ships to 25 trade ships is a very serious blow to the Tsushima economy. And to halt the misuse of the personal seals, right, that have been sent to people or fake people, the Choson government begins to review all of these personal seals, right, to confirm when it was issued, what they know about the biography of the recipient, real or fake. As Korean officials said in 1510, there must be many among them that have died. In other words, this trade system is beginning to fail. After 1510, when exactly the Choson government began issuing personal seals again is not clear, but they did. It did. We know of instances from 1519 and 1520, and especially from the 1530s and later. These recipients were imposter identities, and the Choson court knew this. I'll return to this point in a moment. Three patterns of issuing these new personal seals upon Japanese can be seen over the course of the 16th century. One pattern was to issue a personal seal to a new contact, to someone who, as the word new suggests, has not yet traded with the Choson government. The second pattern was to reissue a personal seal to someone who had been trading already. And the third pattern was to renew the contact privileges within a particular family through, for lack of a better phrase here, contact succession. In other words, I had received a personal seal in the 1460s, whether I'm legitimate or an imposter identity, and I probably died by now. And so the Korean government issues a new personal seal to my successor, my son. And that successor is now able to trade regularly. Stated slightly more carefully, and this is an important point for understanding the trade in the 16th century, the Choson court did not issue personal seals to the successors of contacts, contact succession, to the successors of contact who had traded before 1469, when a new king comes to the throne in Choson. But the Choson court did issue personal seals to the successors of contacts who had begun trading after 1469. In other words, the Choson government seized these contacts from before the new king is enthroned in 1469 as imposters, and we're not certain how they understood these contacts that had begun trading from or after 1469. Probably as imposter identities, but this isn't clear. In other words, the Choson government knew that it was permitting imposter identities to trade in the 15th century, and through these ivory tallies, we know, and the personal seals, we know that it knows that it is permitting imposter identities to continue trading in the 16th century. Unfortunately, given the documents that are available, we do not know how frequently these new imposter identities traded in Chosun in the 16th century. However, the Japanese pirate raid, we're back to the pirates. In 1544 causes the Chosun government to again close the country to Japanese trade. As many of you will remember, from the mid-16th century, not only along the Korean coast, but also along the Chinese coast, a large number of pirate attacks will occur, as well as attacks in the open seas. They closed the country to the Japanese for 3 years, and in 1547 reopened the port of Pusan, only Pusan. And again, everyone knows the answer now. What port did Hideyoshi attack in 1592? 1, 2, 3. All right.
Tongnae.
Well, Tongnae is the county in which our first heckle would be you.
Yes, thank you. That's what I'm here for.
All right, please permit a few details. We know that 57 personal seals were used in the early 1570s and 1580s. The court produced at least 44 of them for fake identities outside Tsushima. Of 23 extant personal seals, that are now in Japan, the Chosun government manufactured at least 13 of them in and after 1552. Now, all of those 23 extant personal seals were held in Tsushima. And if you ask me a question later about this, I can explain how many. Meanwhile, the piracy is continuing into the 1560s. Imposter shoguns who sent embassies to Chosun in 1563 and 1567 asked the Korean king to issue more personal seals to imposter Japanese. The king and his officials must have known that these would be imposter identities, but why permit such trade to continue? The Chosun court knew that the trade was being managed in Tsushima, and they knew that pirate attacks were difficult to prevent and posed various problems for the military along the coast. It seems that the Chosun government continued to permit imposter trade in the second half of the 16th century, in part because it provided a way to protect against pirate attacks. Allow Tsushima Islanders and other people to trade, and they won't attack your grain ships, right? Taking grain from Canton, Chola to Seoul. They won't attack your villages. That is, for the Chosun government, trade was a defense policy in the second half of the 16th century. Now, while we see imposter shoguns frequently sailing to Chosun in the 16th century, we do not see the king of Chosun sending an embassy to Kyoto in the 16th century. In the 1470s, the Korean king had twice sent embassies to Japan, but one was sunk by bad weather, and the envoy of the other fell ill in Tsushima and died while returning to Chosun. Now we return now to the mid-1580s, and we're reaching the end very soon. Here we begin to see the confluence of trade, imposter identities, imposter shoguns, and the absence of Korean embassies to Japan. Hideyoshi's interest in foreign relations with Ming China and Chosun included his desire to receive the king of Chosun's subjugation and to conquer Ming China, which all of you already know. These two goals worried the Japanese, who knew Chosun best, who knew the Chosun government's relations with Ming China best, and who knew Japanese-Korean relations best. From 1587, elites in Tsushima and Hakata, Hakata is today's city of Fukuoka, who would suffer economically from war, labored to avert catastrophe. In 1587, the governor of Tsushima informs the Korean government of Hideyoshi's unification of Japan. But rather than deliver Hideyoshi's demand that the king of Choson submit before Hideyoshi, the governor instead asked that King Sanjo send an embassy to congratulate the new ruler. In other words, if Sanjo sends an embassy to Japan, Sanjo, will not go to Japan. He will send representatives. Right? So Sanjo himself would not have to do that embarrassing vow of subjugation before Hideyoshi. One of his officials would do that. In 1589, Hideyoshi commands the governor of Tsushima to demand that the king of Choson now submit in person and to deliver a warning. Excuse me. And the warning is, if the king of Japan does not assist Hideyoshi in his attack on Ming China, Hideyoshi will invade Choson. The governor of Tsushima then designed an imposter embassy. In the Korean capital, the imposter envoy, who had previously visited Choson as an imposter envoy, and thus was known to Korean officials, suggested that the king of Choson send an embassy to Japan. However, King Sanjo and his officials did not realize that these guests, like those in 1587, were endangering themselves by misrepresenting Hideyoshi's messages to the advantage of the Korean government. This mission in 1589 was so important that this governor of Tsushima travels to Choson. He's the first governor of Tsushima to have ever visited Korea after 200 years of trade. In 1590, Tsushima sent to Choson several men who had participated in a recent pirate raid. This was in response to complaints from the Korean government. Using this as an opportunity, King Sanjo sends an embassy to Hideyoshi. This embassy was to judge the military readiness of Japan and to determine whether Japan would or would not invade. This, of course, is a very famous embassy to Japan, and many of you are familiar with what I'm going to say soon. The Korean envoys arrived in Kyoto, but Hideyoshi was in eastern Japan, besieging one of his foes in that part of the country. The envoys wait for Hideyoshi to return to Kyoto. While they're waiting, they begin to wonder where the four families are for which they had brought gifts. This was common in the early 15th century when embassies traveled frequently to Kyoto. They would bring gifts for powerful families in Japan that were trading in Choson. The Korean officials learned, however, that two of these families had disappeared from political significance in 1551 and 1559 respectively. And they came to doubt whether the other two families possessed any political significance themselves. In other words, the Choson government did not know that traders thought to be legitimate, real traders, had become imposter identities decades earlier. In other words, this family that disappears from politics in 1551, the Ouchi family, has somehow, Ouchi trade ships have continued to sail to Korea. The imposter trade that Tsushima and Hakata were then desperately trying to preserve had been exposed as broader than the Choson government had ever imagined. This discovery, however, showed how dangerously uninformed Korean officials had become about the changes in Japan over the past century and more, and especially in recent years. There was one more feature to this embassy from Choson in 1590. As many of you know already, when these two officials return to Choson, they report to the king and his highest ranking officials. And they belong to different political groups among the government officials. And one of the envoys says, yes, Hideyoshi is prepared to attack, The other official says no, she was not prepared to attack. And King Sanjo dithers for several months after that. One interesting feature of this embassy is the letter that is given to Hideyoshi. Actually, we don't know which letter was given to Hideyoshi. That is, right, the lead envoy carries a letter from the king of Choson. Somewhere between Tsushima and Kyoto, Tsushima Islanders, with the assistance of Korean officials, have rewritten the letter of King Sanjo. The letter that King Sanjo wrote probably included mention of these pirates that had been sent to Choson in 1590. For Tsushima, it would not have been good for that information to reach Hideyoshi. This is because a local official, like the governor of Tsushima, cannot act as a state toward Choson in this context. Only Hideyoshi could have sent those men back to Korea. So, in order to erase, so to speak, this information, the letter from the king of Choson is completely rewritten. But there's a problem. The king of Choson will, of course, have placed his seal on the letter, in at least two places, and probably on the envelope as well. But of course, Tsushima Islanders don't have the king of Korea's seal, do they? Well, over the years, they have made wooden replicas of the king of Choson's seal. And though there are two examples of these wooden seals prepared in Tsushima that are extant today. And all of them have the residue of that red ink that is used for the seals. And Japanese scientists have compared the red ink on these two handwritten versions of not the king of Choson's letter and the ink on these two seals. And the ink on one of the seals matches the ink on the letters. So this letter has obviously been rewritten in Japan, rewritten to improve Tsushima's position vis-a-vis King, vis-a-vis Hideyoshi, and to hopefully somehow avert war in Choson. To conclude, and some of you are probably thinking finally, many men who actually lived in western Honshu and Kyushu in the 15th century actually traded in Choson, as we know. But it is difficult to calculate how many living men and how many imposter identities traded with the Choson government in the 15th and 16th centuries. Nevertheless, setting aside trade by Tsushima Islanders, in the 16th century, a very large percentage of trade conducted under the names of these contacts that were fake Japanese. Their trade was imposter trade. The Choson government knew that imposter trade was occurring and permitted it in part as a way to more effectively protect the southern coastal area from pirate attacks. And the Choson government succeeded at this to the extent that the governor of Tsushima relayed information about suspicious ships sailing nearby. However, the Choson government did not insist upon direct contact with the Japanese government in Kyoto, and did not endeavor to communicate with the ruler, whether a shogun, Oda Nobunaga, or Hideyoshi, until Hideyoshi began threatening continental war and demanding that the king of Choson bow before him. One reason for Hideyoshi's ignorance about Choson and about Japanese relations with Choson was the same dislocation of state-to-state relations from the government in Kyoto and its relocation to Tsushima and Hakata in the early 16th century. Interaction with these fake shoguns contributed to confusion in Seoul when Hideyoshi introduced himself in 1587 as Japan's new leader. That is, Korean kings and their officials did not follow the politics and the warfare in Japan on their own terms in the 16th century. Their worry did not extend beyond pirates. For such reasons, as well as the audacity of Hideyoshi's demands, even when muted by Tsushima elites, King Sanjo and his officials were unable to skillfully interpret signals from the Tsushima and Hakata men representing Hideyoshi. The winter of 1590, when the Choson court finally sent an embassy to Kyoto 120 years later, was too late for the Choson government to begin gathering information in Japan beyond Tsushima. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I think it can entertain. That much time, but we have a few questions. May I pose one question? What are the main items for trade of that time?
Main items for trade from Japan to Choson typically were Southeast Asian products that Ryukyu and Okinawan ships would sail to Southeast Asian ports and trade in Southeast Asian ports, bring back spices, dyes, various other objects to be carried to Japan, and from Japan be carried on a ship into one of the open ports. From Korea, Japanese often received grain. They often requested and received Daejangyeon, the Buddhist sutras. There was a lively silver trade for a while from Japan into Korea. I'm blinking now, so more coffee.
Okay, so next question.
How large were these ships?
I didn't bring the book that would tell me the specific sizes in Choson measure. And there were 3 different sizes that the Korean government permitted, and they would actually measure the ships. So I'm sorry that I can't give you a good answer on that.
What are the main sources of your study? The literature in English or Japanese or Korean?
This is always an embarrassing question to answer. The texts in Hanmun, such as Choson Shilo, and our Korean sources, texts in the Japanese version of Kanbun and Hanmun, various layers of non-Hanmun Japanese, 17th, 16th, 15th centuries, Japanese language scholarship, Korean language scholarship, English language scholarship. I apologize.
Yes.
Why did Toyotomi Hideyoshi basically try to invade Choson, while he knew that Tokugawa Ieyasu was waiting for him to make a big mistake? And Hideyoshi was a greedy man, and it was a very, very risky Bunroku and the Keicho run. Why did he do that? Risking such a... No, his health wasn't good.
This is the $64,000 question that no one can answer. Why did Hideyoshi invade Korea? He must have felt that he could, or his armies, Japanese armies, after a century of honing their skills at war in Japan, would very easily overrun Korea and then soon enough begin fighting in China. Ieyasu, who of course will become the shogun, the first shogun of the next government, is based at this time in eastern Japan, in what becomes the Edo area. And he has just an amazing amount of land, very fertile land, which makes him very rich in the economy of that time, because grains are how you pay your soldiers, for the most part. Hideyoshi must have felt that somehow Ieyasu would not challenge him so long as all of the armies were fighting in Korea or in China. And interestingly, and very helpfully for Ieyasu, he did not send an army to Korea. So many other Japanese generals, for lack of a better word, sent armies to Korea, but not Ieyasu. So he did not squander much of this great economic wealth that he has. He emerges unscathed from the war in Korea.
Just quick on this continuation. That on my way to here tonight, I dropped in the Kyobo bookstore. I read a book, very thick Japanese book, Bunroku and Keisho no Da. This is exactly what you study. Of course, on your subject is pirates. I briefly read that Hideyoshi had to invade Choson with one, basically, he needed rice field. He had many generals. He won unified Japan, and he had to award all this general with rice field. But he had already assigned all rice field, same patch 2-3 times to 10 different generals. So this created some problem among generals. So he needed the rice field, and he noticed in Korea, get the rice field, assign them as a reward. I think I just briefly saw it. I didn't go into too much.
So just a brief response to the individual. Excuse me, the individual impact. I'm not arguing with you, but this does raise the question of why Hideyoshi would have proceeded beyond Seoul, up to Pyongyang and into Hamgyongdo, if the southern provinces were his main goal. I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone can really argue with great certainty just why Hideyoshi did.
Yeah, when I was in Japan, I heard another explanation. I'm sure you heard this as well, so I'd like to get your opinion. Is that after unifying the country, there was overabundance of samurai and soldiers, and there was a concern with the French government that unless there was some employment, that there would be an outbreak of warfare again. So, yeah, let's go for China, but if we don't make it, it's okay because we have removed a potentially volatile component of our society. And why not just send the Christian troops at the front? Because we'll get rid of that problem in the same process. Have you heard this? I think you have.
The Christian troops refers to the Christian daimyo in Kyushu, who of course, where Kyushu has wonderful rice. Before, I think it's the aging process is accelerating. I think it's 1589 that Hideyoshi introduces what's in Japanese what's called hei no bunri, right, the separation of farmers from the soldiers, the samurai. And the samurai are to move into the cities, and the farmers are to farm. And that would be a way of reducing the number of men carrying weapons. And I've always wondered whether that was a wise policy, given what happens from late 1591, or from 1591 when it begins the process of preparing for the invasion. I don't know. There was a question. Yes.
What did they use for the trade? Was it straightforward barter? Was there a currency used? Was it a mix of the two? How was that carried out? And then I assume after the goods arrived in either Japan or Korea, there were any number of more intermediaries? Or was the continuous transport of goods carried out by government agencies?
Mostly yes. There was trade conducted at the ports in Choson province. Let's ignore that because we don't really know the details of how it's conducted. But use your legitimate contact, and so you send a representative to Choson. He arrives at the port. A few days later, he begins traveling to Seoul. He reaches Seoul, and a few days later, he introduces himself to the king of Choson by doing the proper bows, and he presents gifts from you to the king of Choson. This, if you want to use a phrase for this, we could call it tribute trade, from someone of lower status up to the king of Choson, who has permitted this trade to occur, this visit and trade to occur. Okay, that ceremony is completed. A few days later is what the Japanese are aiming at. And that's a meeting with, in Korean it was called the Yejo, in English the Board of Rites, R-I-T-E-S, which obviously oversaw various of the ceremonies that the court conducted throughout the year, but it also oversaw the details. It managed the details of foreign relations with China, with Japan, with Ryukyu, with Jurchen, Yajin, Yain, people in northern Hamgyongdo. So at that meeting with the Board of Rights officials, there is an exchange. This helps me to answer one of the questions earlier, of what the Japanese have brought typically to Southeast Asian goods. And they're very interested in Korean cloth. And so there are negotiations over the cloth and the goods the Japanese have brought. Now, typically, 100% of the Japanese goods were not accepted during this official negotiation of exchange price, exchange rate, with the Board of Rights. But also present then were merchants, sole merchants, who had been officially recognized by the Choson government and were permitted to participate in these meetings. And after then this trade with the Board of Rights, then the Japanese could trade with the merchants. Their meeting, if there still were items left over, the Japanese then, with an escort, could take them into an open market. And with a Korean interpreter of Japanese, negotiate with the sole merchants in the markets.
Wholesale merchants.
Presumably. I don't know the 16th century or 15th century word for wholesale merchants.
It would seem odd that the Japanese sellers of the goods actually were doing retail sale in Dongdaemun Shijang.
Well, the Korean government is permitting this.
That's
because
there was already a huge system of the guilds, the Kie, and the Domesan, all tied up. So
you know, the Choson Wangjo Shildo doesn't like the little guy in Korean history. It loves the king, but it doesn't like the merchants.
This makes good sense. Thank you.
One last.
Time. We have to run out of time, sir.
Okay, so.
We'll get to you in a moment.
I'm not sure if you ever heard that one of the reasons that Japan invaded Korea was to take in the porcelain makers, pottery workers away to Japan, because at that time porcelain was a high-tech thing. So have you ever heard of
Well, one of the names for the war, of course, is the Potters' War, which rather unfair to all of the men involved in the printing industry who also were taken to Japan. To what extent that was a goal of all of the armies that invaded Choson from early in the middle of the third month over the next several weeks, we don't know. As you know far better than I, the Kyushu area governors seem to have been most interested in the pottery, in the potters. And
so I know that during the engineering period, lots of pottery makers were taken
right.
to Japan.
Yeah. Absolutely true.
Tonkaki experts.
Yeah. Absolutely true. There's I think, what is it called? In Japanese, Nae Shirogawa. There's a place in today's Kagoshima prefecture in southernmost Kyushu. And that's a village. In that area is a village of Korean potters. I believe it's the Son family that has maintained the Korean family name for the past 400 years. I believe there was a question right here.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up question to your explanation of the Japanese traders would then come to Seoul with their goods and then spend some time here, presuming themselves the king and then the board of rights and then maybe to the markets. You may not know this, but was there accommodation? I mean, there's no system of hotels at that time. Where would they stay while they were here in Seoul?
This is a good question. The Korean government, perhaps following Ming China's example, I don't want to say, obviously, that everything the Choson government did was based upon Ming China. That's just obviously not true. But Korean embassies are constant every year visiting Ming China. So when they would reach Nanjing early on and then later Beijing, there was a huge guest house for folks from all over the place. The Korean government, the Choson government, built a specific guest house for Japanese, a specific guest house for Chinese visitors, and a specific guest house for the Jurchens, the Yaji, who are coming from Hangenbukto. If you go down, if you take Tongyelo, right, from Independence Gate, you just go straight to, what is it, Sasumulo, and turn left, and go down that street, and you've got all those high-rise business buildings on the right-hand side. Well, one of those business buildings is located on the side where the Chinese hostel.
It's called the Taepyeonggwa.
Right. Thank you. The Taepyeonggwa, right? The Hall of Great Peace. The Japanese was called the Tongpyeonggwa, right? The Hall of Eastern Peace. And the Jurchen residence, which was apparently where the Ide Hospital is now located, was called the Hall of Northern Peace. And so that's where they would stay, and then they would be escorted. At least in the case of the Japanese and the Jurchens, they would be escorted right through one of the gates. We don't know which gate, right, into the capital. Now, I don't know exactly where the gate was. I don't know if the Chinese hostel was inside the gate or outside the gate. If someone knows, please tell me.
Inside the gate.
Inside the gate? That would make sense.
Where Myeongji University's campus used to be, just inside,
Behind the Samsung buildings.
just inside the South Gate.
That would make sense given the hierarchy
Exactly.
of diplomacy.
The Korea Review in about 1904 published a whole series of translations of the regulations governing the visit by Japanese envoys, how much food each of these boats and crew and all these people they receive. Do you know? Have you seen that book? what envoys would those have been?
This is embarrassing. I have to see the. I'm not trying to duck the question. I'm trying to admit ignorance.
That's fine. It's too general a question. I can't remember when it would date from.
There were several such texts prepared in the late Choson period. Kyori-ji, Kori-1-ji, and several other texts. In my period, there's only one such. Outside of the information scattered in the Shilluk, there's only one such text.
Any other questions?
You said that the Choson government was complicit in all this, basically, fraud. But I'm curious, at some point they must have, just through any kind of blind luck, uncovered an imposter where it was so obvious that they must have had to punish somebody. Did that ever happen?
Of course. I mean, I touched upon some of these.
Oh, I thought it was that.
Yeah. Well, excuse me, these two fake countries that no one has asked about. The Korean government saw through those immediately, and one was a country approximately Hokkaido, and another was a country that was placed in the sea somewhere south of Ryukyu, Okinawa. And very, very quickly they saw through those and forced asked the representatives to return to their home country, wherever that may have been. Obviously Japan.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.